Mark Childerson. I'm one of the co-founders and the product manager of Garner. Decided to go with a little cartoon rather than a headshot because, let's face it, you look at a headshot, you think one of two things. That's a terrible photo, or he's having a terrible day. So, Garner is a supply chain, cloud-based supply chain visibility and collaboration system. It's ideal for AWP, but it's not restricted to AWP. And it has three main aspects. There's a modeling aspect, a workflow aspect, and an analytics. And what I'm going to be talking about today is how the kinds of data that we can collect through the workflows are helpful to drive and control workflows and also come out in analytics. And I'm going to be doing that with an example of a real project. So the Garner system, because it's supply chain, it has to pull together data from all the different players in the supply chain, right? The owners, the EPCs, vendors, customs guys, logistics, everybody, right? And we pull that data together in two ways. We pull it together with direct system-to-system integrations via our API or their API or uploads. And we also provide a human user interface for people to actually interact with, because one of the things we're going to be talking about today, and one of the things that we've kind of discovered over the last few years, is that the most important data in the supply chain is very often sitting in emails and spreadsheets and all kinds of homebrew thingies that aren't pulled together. And so we want to pull all of that together and get people out of their email. These are some of the projects, a few of the projects that Garner's been involved on. So we've been involved on major projects for the last 15 plus years. And our experiences in those projects of things that have gone well and things that have gone poorly have really shaped our understanding of data and the kind of data that you need and the kinds of things that you need to do with that data. Okay, so first thing is that there's change, right? There's always change in any kind of environment. So here's typical examples of supply chain data that might have been represented. Obviously the top is what you get from a track and trace system for a particular material. You know, it was purchased, there was a purchase order issued, and there were ship dates forecast and actuals and all those kinds of things, right? And that's what you see in smart plant materials or whatever. And then the bottom is a freight profile that you get out of a typical project, right? I'll look ahead. Here's our freight coming, here's what it is. And you can see that it starts small, as freight profiles do, the project's just beginning, ramps up into full volume, and then declines as the project completes. So they're fairly typical examples of supply chain data we have. But both of those are extremely static. Obviously, the first one is static in that it's a look back at the past, and one view of the past at that. And the second one, it's a look at the future, but it's a look at the future as of today. And what we think is important is to take the data and the changes in the data over time, so you can change those kind of static views, those snapshots, into something more like a movie. And then that gives you a more profound understanding of what you're doing. So first I'm going to talk about what the supply chain is. And from Garner's point of view, the supply chain is the life story of all the materials combined together. And the life story of a material is not just when it's made, it's when you define that material in your early engineering, in your material takeoff list, or even before your requisitions and all that stuff. And then the life cycle of the material goes right through until it's installed at the workplace. So it's a very, very large fraction of the project is, in our view, part of the supply chain. And so I'm going to focus on just one part of the supply chain today, what we call the middle of the supply chain, from the time that purchase order is issued until the time the material arrives at a lay down close to the site or maybe on the site. And the reason why I'm going to focus on that is because in many ways that's the most difficult part of the supply chain. That's where you really get all the different contractors, all the different parties working together or not necessarily working together and causing trouble. You know, you've got your vendors, your logistics providers, your customs brokers, people operating warehouses, all kinds of stuff have to pull together. And so that's what I'm going to focus on. And so again, here's a typical example of what you might see from a track and trace system in an area event. The required on-site date is June 30th, as we can see over there. The PO is issued on January 15th. Materials inspected May 5th. There's a vendor promise date of May 10th. And strangely, there's a forecast ship date of June 5th, which is late, and a forecast delivery date of July 20th, also late. So that's interesting with the promise date of May 10th, what's going on. And then this thing is shipped on the 5th of June and delivered on the 20th of July. And so looking at this material, we we'd look at it and say, okay, well, clearly the vendor missed the promise date and that material arrived 3 weeks late. And so maybe that was actually having an impact on construction, or maybe it was just absorbed in your flow. We don't really know, but it's a problem. And having materials that are arriving late, if that's happening too often, that's causing the project to run in different ways, which are inefficient. But that's not really the whole story. The whole story is more what we capture in Garner. So what we can see is, as of January 1st, the required on-site date is June 30th. The PO was issued on January 15th, as we see. But then we see that on January 18th, the vendor acknowledged that PO, and they said, okay, our promise date is May 10th, and our expected ship date is May 10th, with an expected delivery date of June 24th. So right now, everything's looking good. We expect to get that material there on time. So the vendor could proceed to manufacturing, and then on April 1st, they're requesting an inspection from QA, and they're requesting that inspection for April 10th, saying, okay, we're ready, please come inspect it so we can move forward. But QA drops the ball, misses that. They send an email, no one noticed. And it's not until April 21st that QA says, oops, okay, yep, we'll schedule that inspection. They schedule it for May 5th, it's gonna happen. And now the next day, the vendor says on April 22nd, okay, well now we're gonna update our ship dates, June 5th, delivery date of June 24th, or sorry, July 20th. And now we know that this material is gonna be late. Then the inspection happens on May 5th. Shipped on June 5th as now expected, and it arrives on July 20th. And now we know the true cause of the problem, which was this late inspection. And so capturing this data, which we capture in the Garner system, is not just about knowing who to blame, right? So, oh, it's QA's problem, it's not the vendor's problem. It's about finding those problems early enough that they can be adapted. Having a situation where on April 3rd, QA's manager or the expediter said, wait a second, we got a problem here, this inspection's not been scheduled, you need to get on top of that. Capturing all that data can help you understand what's really going on, can help you control it. And also, having this richness of data means that when you're looking at performance improvements, things like that later, you can make things actually work better. So what kind of data are we talking about? Well, there's so many dates in a project, right? In construction, we've got the CWP start and end date on the official schedule. We've got our CWP start dates and end dates of what we think is actually gonna happen, which often is not exactly the same thing. We have IWP start and end dates forecast for those. Procurement has the required ship date and the forecast vendor promise date. Logistics has the forecast delivered to carrier date when the material should get to the quayside. And then each of those groups uses these dates to communicate as well, right? So procurement and logistics communicate with the forecasted vendor ready to ship date. Logistics and construction with a forecasted delivery date. And they all together communicate with the required on-site date, which should be driven by your CWP dates, your actual project plan. So it's very important that these dates be very live and that we understand how those updates happen. Obviously, changes in these dates can indicate all kinds of things. They can have knock-on impacts, or they can indicate problems. So if your IWP forecast start dates are changing all the time, you shouldn't be planning that far ahead. Jeff Ryan says 90 days in ahead. That if they're changing too much, that means that you're having problems with constraints. You know, you're not going to have your materials, your scaffolding, or whatever it is there in time, or you have problems with estimating, with resources, with sizing your IWPs. If the end dates of the IWPs are changing, then that means you definitely have problems with estimating size, and Kevin was talking about that yesterday, that's getting you into a lot of trouble if you're not closing them properly and on time. Again, if your required on-site dates change, which they ought to be changing, they ought to be live as your project schedule updates and even as your informal schedule updates. They can cause impacts too. If they move out, you can have materials arriving too soon, and if they move back, you can have materials arriving too late. It's when you want them, which is obviously an important thing. And then the ready to ship and delivery dates. Obviously, if those things are changing, they can have impacts on materials not being there on time, construction delays, too much ability. So I'm going to focus on one of the examples that I'm going to have written down for. So vendor ready ship dates, a key KPI for the project, right? You're saying, are you shipping on time as you forecasted to your vendors? But what does that on time really mean? Right? So we can imagine two materials, both required on site June 30th, both issued PO January 15th. Vendor acknowledged same day. Forecast the same ship dates. All good so far, they're gonna arrive on time, right? Now on February 1st, one of the vendors says, oh, sorry, not gonna make that date. It's gonna be 3 weeks late. And that could be because they have material shortages or any number of things, right? And that's a problem, but you've got 3 months to do something about that. So you can replan, you can decide what you can expedite, you've got a lot of options. Second vendor, April 30th, says the same thing. Oops, we're gonna ship June 5th. But now, instead of having months of time to deal with the problem, you only have days of time to deal with the problem. And so then again, we ship them, we deliver them late, but as expected. And so now we have two different materials in a track and trace system or in SmartPlan. We've seen the data from SmartPlan. These look exactly the same. And they think the story is the same. But in fact, the story is very, very, very different. And so that's why you need to have a system that's sensitive, not just to the dates, but to the changes in the dates and the origin of the changes and all these things, so that you can really do what needs to be done to keep the supply chain moving. Oops. So the real data. So here's some real data from the Golden Pass project for a particular vendor. I'm not going to name him. We've been working on the Golden Pass for the last 2 or 3 years, something like that, quite a while. So this vendor is a significant vendor. You know, here's the number of materials that they shipped month by month, quite a lot of things. On the top, we have 2 graphs. Each one is comparing the actual ship date with the forecast ready to ship date. Higher is late. The green line is the 80th percentile, so 80% of materials were less late than that. Orange is the median, and blue is the 20th percentile. And these 2 graphs at the top are different because we're looking at the data as how far ahead of when they ship. So this is 60 days in advance of shipment, and that's 10 days in advance of shipment. And so what this is showing is that, you know, in this period of 2023, the median shipment was like 50 days late. So that means you're looking at the schedule saying, I'm shipping in 60 days, no problem. Well, in fact, the median material actually shipped nearly 2 months later than that, not 60 days later than that. 10 days out, things are looking much, much, much better. The median material is only shipping, it's actually shipping a little bit early in that time period, but it's very, very close to the forecast. And so this kind of data matters because when we think about what is the forecast ready to ship date, there's no such the ready to ship date. A lot of systems keep updating live. Obviously, it's important to update live. You want your freight forwarder to know this, right? But they update live and they forget about this. And so you have situations where your vendors are like, hey, we're meeting our forecast ship dates. You know, our forecasts are reliable. And procurement's saying, yeah, our forecasts are reliable. But construction's saying, yeah, but nothing's really happening when I'm expecting it. What's going on? And so you need to track these forecast dates far enough out to plan, to work with them, and to understand them. Next thing we talk about required site dates, right? Here's an example material. On January 1st, required site date is June 30th. PO was issued January 15th, vendor acknowledges January 8th, May 10th, usual thing that we just did. And then on February 15th, that required date is changed to September 30th. It's pushed out over 3 months. And then the material goes ahead and ships and is delivered early. And so what? Firstly, these required site dates are critical because the whole point of the supply chain is to get your materials when you want them. That's all we do, right? That's what the supply chain's for. But when you want them, if it can change, then obviously you may not get your materials when you want them. And so in this case, there's a lot of actions that could be taken, right? Potentially, as soon as you know that the schedule had slipped and your required site date was later, you could say to the vendor, okay, hold on to the material, ship it later. Now maybe they have a contract that says, you ordered it for delivery on such and such a date, too bad, I'm delivering it that day and it's gonna cost you a fortune to delay, that happens. Or maybe when you started out, you established a contract with a vendor that gave you that option of delay, right? You're gonna have to pay extra for that, but probably a lot less than the after the fact delay. And so capturing this kind of data, how often your required dates change, when they change, how much they change, this can give you a sense of how much it's worth paying for that option. Because the consequences of not getting that option can be severe. That if you're running with 1 month's materials in laydown and then suddenly you have 3 or 4 months, then you need 3-4 times as much laydown space as you thought. That is a big difference. That's a huge expense. So here's actual data, again, from the Golden Pass project for piping, okay? And so in the bottom part of the slide, we've got the number of pipe materials, mostly spools, but not exclusively, issued with their PO, ordered month by month, the PO issue date. And I've used a log scale here because the number varies quite widely. You can see it's a very big period this time. And then on the top, we have the fraction of those materials whose required on-site date was pushed out by more than a month between when the material was ordered and when the material was delivered. So again, we're capturing the change in required on-site date during the production of that material. And the first thing we can see is that happens a lot, right? 20, 30, 40% of materials experience a push out of the required on-site date by a month or more on this project. Interestingly, in this period, we can see that when we're ordering a lot of the materials, we're probably ordering them in order of when they're needed. And we can see that the ones we ordered first, the ones we're going to use soon, generally had a lower fraction pushed out. And the ones we ordered later, that we weren't going to need for quite some time, had a higher fraction pushed out. And this speaks to kind of lean principle of not doing too much too early and a whole lot of things, right? Don't just get all your pipe orders out at once, because then you're going to experience those required on-site date changes. But then what we found later in the project is that the fraction did tend to decline. So that meant that the match between ordering materials and delivery of materials when you want them was getting better. And so we can see that this project certainly had a lot pushed out, and so certainly these required on-site date changes are common, or date changes are common, and so you want to think about that in your contracts. But it did see that it was experiencing over time. I'm also going to talk about IWP start dates. Now, Garner's a supply chain system.
Mark,
Yes?
if you're ready to ship dates shift by a month and a half, 2 months, and you require on-site shifts by a month, 2 months, it's a wash.
Yeah, you can get lucky, that's true. So I think...
No, my question is, what actions did the project team take having this data?
Right. So, in fact, they weren't really on top of this action, because what they actually had, all their contracts, they couldn't really shift them around anyway. There was a huge challenge on the particular project where the contracts were such that materials could be delivered per the original schedule, and not just delivered at their origin in China, but actually transmitted to the States. And so the action the project ended up taking was acquiring more laydown space, which was costly.
Mark?
Yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
I apologize if you answered it already.
No, go
Are
ahead.
you gathering data during execution to help reforecast and assist with root cause analysis? Or are you gathering data post-execution to see those trends and then assist?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we gather data during execution for execution. That's our primary purpose, is as an operational execution system to keep on top of things. But what we find is that analyzing the data later is also extremely interesting. And our actual contract with this particular project, we had a contract with, it's Golden Pass, so we know that that's ExxonMobil plus Zachary was the main EPC on it. It didn't really, the project didn't fully understand the possibilities of the data and had a lot of structures in place before we were brought on. And so there's kind of another story that we're trying to tell here, which is understand the capabilities of the data and the systems that you have, and do that early enough that you can write your contracts to bear that in mind. And so what happens is if you write all your vendor contracts first, you end up having a lot of things locked in, and then having this data becomes more root cause analysis rather than correcting. So it's really important to think about that right.
Isn't the main purpose to resequence the work when you see that, when you have more visibility? That's the purpose of.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. Is to, and that's going to be my last slide. But yeah, basically having the reality feed back into the expectations and feed back into the plans, and do it with a proper feedback loop rather than a waterfall 1, 2, 3 process is the key. And to do that, you need to capture the whole suite of the data and to think about the data. And I think this is a very important thing, is to think about the data not just at this point in time, right? And whenever you say the required date, the forecast date, the this date, and the that date, 99% of the time, well, 90% of the time, it's not the, it's and it's important to think about that. So those are great questions. And so in Garnet World, for this project, as well as capturing all the material data, we were actually capturing the IWP plan data. And so here's an example of the replanning of an IWP. You know, you plan them months out in advance. They move a little bit in the planning period. You know, here was pushed out a couple weeks, that's fine, and it's pulled back as your schedule is getting better. You're updating the schedule fairly continuously and experiencing these changes, and all these are pretty innocuous changes. But then the next one, so sort of back it up. So now on March 25th, we're planning to start May 5th. So we've got a fair bit of lead time before we start. But then on April 20th, 2 or 3 weeks before we start, it's in the 3-week look ahead. We go, oops, and push the planned start date out to June 30th. And that's a problem, right? That's an indicative of something, an indication of something really going wrong. And that could be either the materials just not being there, even though you expected all along that they were going to be there, or a resource constraint, or some other construction problem, right? Some issue. And so that kind of replanning can sometimes be good, sometimes be bad. And I don't know about the projects that you're involved. I guess on BSEP, did you have the data of when IWPs were planned and how often they were replanned?
Yeah, the challenge was to create an initial backlog, and then it takes several months to get that backlog and have sufficient buffer. But it took about 3 to 4 months to have the ideal backlog, which is about 6 to 8 weeks.
Right. And so did you have materials and laydown sufficient then in advance?
Well, that was a challenge because we paused the fabrication of the pipe spools, and so we had to resequence a lot of the IWPs depending on the availability.
Right.
And so the sooner you can do that, the less disruptive it is. Now, what we also found was that CWPs are too big, IWPs are too small. And also, our initial plan was to have the pipe fabricators supply IWPs, and we dropped that plan as a result of the pause. And I think that's too small, that's inefficient for the pipe fabricator.
Right.
While the CWP is too big, and waiting to start a CWP before all the materials on site. So what we did is create an intermediate level, and I think that would work also for your logistics.
Yes, yeah. No,
You
that's
cannot
good.
ship an IWP from China and say, hey, push this IWP forward. You know?
Exactly,
So
yeah. If
it's
you're building
not
in China, you've got all
efficient.
kinds of problems with your little supports and all kinds of things, not just your pipe tools. Did you have something you want to say?
No, but I always can.
Okay, we'll hold off on that for
Yeah.
just a couple of minutes. We're almost there. And so here's the actual data from Golden Pass. So, just for piping, this is the number of IWPs that they were planning to start month by month through the project. And this was the fraction of them that were pushed off by a month or more once they entered into the 3-week look ahead. And so again, you can see early on, that was quite a lot of disruption, 20–30%. It's like, okay, it's in the 3-week look ahead, we're ready to go. It's like, oh no, push it off a month, 2 months, 3 months, long period of time. And then we found that as the project continued, they got control of that. They started doing that much more successfully. The number pushed off was lower. It's certainly possible that we saw the required on-site date before, so it's possible that they were running heavy on inventory at this stage, and so that meant they had fewer constraint issues. So there might be an ideal level of IWPs that are pushed off. If none are ever pushed off, it means that you're running heavy on inventory, and if too many are pushed off, it's a problem. So that's a matter for further investigation, but we certainly see that they did get more control over their IWP schedules that went on. So quite similar to your experience of.
Yeah, I think you have to pick a poison, and if the poison I would pick is a larger laydown, I'd rather have that than having to resequence IWPs or not having the materials.
You certainly want to have enough materials. Yeah, if you're resequencing IWPs, it should be this kind of number, not this kind of number, for sure. And so what are the takeaways? Well, we kind of jumped on this before. You know, here's the classic model that people love to think, and it's funny because we all know that projects don't actually work that way, and yet everybody tries to pretend that they do. Because really, this is what happens. Your plans change, expectations change, your reality changes, all this stuff is happening. And so the takeaways are, given that they change over time, we have to set our processes to be adaptable. We have to take up that variability somewhere, right? And we can do that in contracts with suppliers and get contracts for capacity rather than this is delivered here, here, and here. We can save money on that. Or other ways. As Childerson says, that a bigger laydown. But again, that comes with cost. You want to right size it. So in Golden Pass, they did have challenges with that where they had to go out and get extra laydown space during the project. And they were quite constrained to begin with because the project site itself is in an environmentally sensitive wetland, which we're going to be getting more and more of the time. And then you obviously need a system that captures this data, right? And the Garden system does capture this data, does let you work with it, does alert people to it, does let people build that into your workflow. And this is critical. And this is what Fernando was talking about as well. Make sure you get that data. Okay, that's it. Questions for either of us?
One thing I do want to comment.
Oh, sorry,
before
one last
before
thing.
we do that. Yeah,
So
so.
wait, Fernando, we gotta say something good about Golden Pass. The happy ending was, Golden Pass, like, we were kind of dissing it a little bit, but they actually did very well. Firstly, they were committed to AWP by getting the Garden system in advance and capturing that data. A lot of projects haven't done that and still haven't done that. We're working on that, but so far they still haven't. And also, we see that they did improve over time. They did improve the quality of all of their required site dates and improve the quality of their IWPs. So they are getting better. Now we can talk about any questions or how we can make that happen.
Yeah, actually, I'll start because Golden Pass is an interesting one because we were working with Toyota on the modules and getting data reliable enough so they could work with their supply chain, even though supply chain, their module fabricators weren't really interested in AWP, but we controlled the data and we fed data, and so that changed behavior, and so they knocked it out of the ballpark with delivery of the module. So your end and my end and all that was really made that a great success. But I also want to emphasize, and we've been talking about digital strategy, and then you're bringing up a really good point. This is only one part of a project delivery program, right? So if you don't have your own strategy, whether there's a contracting strategy that goes with this, there's a technology plan, all these things that are very, very important